Hanan Melech HaOlam, Asher Kidshana, B'mitzvotav v'tzivana la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed be the Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. So welcome everybody here tonight to another installment of the study of Ezekiel. We're going to do chapter 26 tonight. When I first started out, I was going to do 26 and 27, and then I thought, well, once I got into it, you know how it is. I said, well, I'm already up to about 5,000 words written down, and so I said, well, maybe not. We'll just go to the 26. And I think hopefully it'll be a fun history lesson for you tonight, if nothing else. So let's go ahead and begin with this. Shoot it over here to where we're at, but I'll get to the lesson here pretty quickly. Okay. As you can see, in the south of Lebanon, there's evidence of an ancient battle. I mean, the evidence is still there today. That was so fierce that it actually permanently altered the Mediterranean coastline. There's a little peninsula that juts out from the mainland in the place where a real proud island city once refused an invader, and so it did not end well for them. And so we're going to see the story tonight about these guys that defied Alexander the Great. That's one of the things you don't want to do, is defy Alexander. So the city is called Tyre, and it's located 20 kilometers, 12 miles north of the Israeli border with Lebanon, and about 80 kilometers or 50 miles south of the Lebanese capital of Beirut. And so here's where we're talking about right here, the city of Tyre. And but the Israeli border kind of goes up here over Dan, because Dan is in Israel, of course. So it just kind of juts up like this. And so it's, everybody's heard of Tyre and Sidon. And so tonight we're going to be talking about Ezekiel and his prophecy about the fall of Tyre. Now, the ancient city of Tyre consisted of two parts. The first part of the city was it was on the mainland, and the second part of the city was an island that's about a kilometer from the shore. And the island city of Tyre was also blessed with with not only one, but it had two really good harbors that faced opposite sides of the island. And so that, no matter what the prevailing weather was, they had a good harbor that they could use. And so the North Harbor was called the Sidonian Harbor, and because Sidon was up to the north, and it's actually still in operation. That harbor is still being used today as one of the best natural harbors on the eastern Mediterranean Sea. So when they have two excellent sheltered harbors, then that gave the city a great advantage and for shipping. And back in those days, because they did everything by sail, of course. And so the idea of having two ports, and no matter what the prevailing wind was, whether it was in the northers that would blow in or the southern breezes, or whichever one, they could find a good safe harbor there in Tyre. And so that made it one of the one of the most important commercial shipping cities in the Mediterranean at that time. And so, they had they didn't have so much water itself on the island, but they had the property, the land on the mainland, and so that's where they got water, probably in bottles, the big jars and stuff. So it was all the mainland side and the city and the island side was called Tyre. And so there's a picture here that I've showed of Tyre in 1934, an aerial photo. It looks quite different than it does today. Here's what it looks pretty much like today, with and some of these things here, the Alexander's Causeway and some of this other stuff here was, those are archaeological features in Tyre, but there's really nothing survived from back in the time that we're talking about here with Ezekiel. It was all pretty much destroyed. And so, but that's kind of what it looks like today. And so at first, Tyre, and I'm just going to give you a lot of background on Tyre because I think it's important to know how that, the relationship between Tyre and Judah, Tyre and Israel. And so at first, this city-state of Tyre enjoyed real good relations with Israel and Judah. Although the relationship was commercial and not based on any religious or cultural sympathy, because they were totally different people groups. And so when King Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem, King Hiram of Tyre, he supplied cedar from the forest of Lebanon and a whole lot of other materials. He even sent in skilled laborers to help with some of the the building of the temple. And so of course the Bible says that for this King Hiram was very well paid. Okay, so one export that really contributed a great deal to the wealth of Tyre was purple clothing dye, making the cloth of the they would dye cloth purple, and they came from it became known as Tyrian purple, and it was the most precious dye of its time, in large part because of the large amount of work labor that was required to make just a little bit, little amounts. And so they had to capture these murex shellfish from the Mediterranean Sea, and they were captured in traps. And then it took, a lot of shellfish to produce just a tiny, an ounce or so. For example, it took as many as 12,000 of these little murex shells to produce the dye for one single garment. And so for this reason, owning garments dyed purple was, it was prohibitively expensive for most people. And in time, that color of the purple was associated with royalty. And in some countries, you were forbidden to wear purple unless you were royalty of some sort. So the people in Tyre and Sidon, that whole region of, let me go back to this whole region here and on up to the north, all of that was called Phoenicia. And these were the principal cities of the Phoenician people group there. And they had come from the western or central and western part of the Mediterranean. And so they were mostly just city states, and there was not a real centralized government there. And so they were seafaring people, the Phoenicians were, and their merchant ships went all over the Mediterranean and made these cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, made them very, very wealthy. And so the religion of Tyre was, they were culturally, these people were Canaanites, and they spoke a variation of the Canaanite language, and they worshiped variations of the same gods as the Canaanite people in Israel. The fertility god, commonly referred to as Baal in the Bible, was commonly worshipped in Phoenicia, along with their attendant practices of the ritualized prostitution, sex worship, infant sacrifice, the whole thing that the Canaanites did. And the particular Baal deity that they worshiped was named Melkart. And the Greeks saw Melkart as a variation of their own demigod, Heracles or Hercules to the Romans. So this connection to the Greek divine hero of myth would actually play a part in the city, play a part in the city's downfall. So the Tyrian Baal worship of Melkart seems to have been introduced into the 10 tribes of Israel during the reign of King Ahab. You remember Ahab unwisely made a marriage alliance for the daughter of the Phoenician king of Sidon, and his name was Ethbaal, meaning with Baal. And of course, Ethbaal's daughter was the infamous, or famous, more like infamous, Jezebel. And she was an active, aggressive promoter of the worship of Melkart, and a vicious opponent of the worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So after this point in history, when once Ahab married Jezebel, the relationship with Tyre kind of started going south, and then the prophet Joel actually accused the people of Tyre and Sidon of selling people of Judah into slavery to the Greeks. They'd go out there, he said that they would capture Judeans and then sell them, and take them far away from Judea and Israel. So anyway, that takes us to the scripture that we're going to start out with. So anyway, just stand by. This is going to be a real nerdy history lesson tonight. On the first day of the month, in the 11th year, the word of Adonai came to me, saying, Son of man, because Tyre has said against Jerusalem, aha, she is shattered, and the gateway of the peoples, she is turned over to me. I will be filled now that she is laid waste. All right. So what in the world did that mean? The date here that we're talking about is not real certain, not real clear. Daniel Block, the guy that I'm using his book as a major source of what I'm saying here tonight. He says that would have been about the 3rd of February of 585 BCE. And that was right around the time when, they got the word there in Babylon that Jerusalem had fallen, even though Jerusalem had fallen, 5 months earlier on the 9th of Av. The temple was destroyed on the 9th of Av in 586 BCE. But that date, there depends on the commentators. Some of them say no, it's 585. Some say it's 586. But most of the Jewish sources that I use, they say the 9th of Av in 586, and that would have put it sometime in August timeframe. and then this one would have been sometime afterwards. So it was definitely after the fall of Jerusalem that this episode here takes place. This prophecy takes place. Now, Tyre looked at Jerusalem and Judah and the Jews and all that, not so much as enemies. They weren't enemies. They were just trading rivals. They were merchants, and so they were always trying to get one up on everybody else. So Israel and Judah, there was definitely one of their rivals in commerce. And so with the destruction of Jerusalem, that of course Israel had already fallen 100 years before, but with the destruction of Jerusalem, then that opened up the people of Tyre thought, aha, now we will get to grab onto those trade routes that go through Jerusalem and along through Israel. We'll take over those trade routes, and then that way we can charge duty on those things, and we'll make a lot of money. And so that's what that meant when she says, the Bible says, aha, she is shattered, the gateway of the peoples. Well, the gateway are the trade routes that went up and down through Israel and the Levant there. And the trade routes were very important. And of course, Egypt and Assyria and Egypt and Babylon and Egypt, they kept fighting over the trade routes there. So and I think I even have, here's some pictures of some of the major trade routes. Now this one here, you need to kind of turn it clockwise 90 degrees to get the idea of it, because this is north here. And if you look at it here, you got Tyre and Sidon, and then over here you got Tyre and Sidon. So this particular map, they oriented this way because it's well, I don't know why they did that. Maybe just presented better, but it is kind of confusing. You do have to turn it up 90 degrees to get a good picture, and you can see it on the green one there where it really is. But there are a lot of trade routes that go along with that. The one right along the coastline there was called the Via Maris, the way of the sea, that and very, very important trade route there. And then, of course, over here, the King's Highway, another very important trade route, and it went through Petra. And so those were probably the two greatest one. Now, this one here that went through Hatzor and back up to Damascus, that was very important too. So trade routes were very important to everything back in those days. That's one reason. But Solomon spent a good bit of money and taxes on setting up fortresses and outposts, military outposts along these trade routes, so that they could secure them from robbers and so forth. So they wanted people to go through Israel with their trade routes and not go over on the King's Highway, because then they couldn't charge taxes or duty or anything on them like that. So, all right, going ahead. Therefore, thus says Adonai Elohim, behold, I am against you, Tyre. I will bring up many nations against you as the sea brings up its waves. They will destroy the walls of Tyre and tear down her towers. I will sweep her dust from her and make her a bare rock. She will be a place for the spreading of nets in the midst of the sea. For I have spoken it. It is a declaration of Adonai. She will become plunder for the nations, and her daughters in the field will be slain by the sword, so that they will know that I am Adonai. Now notice, this prophecy makes certain predictions. It says that many nations would come against Tyre. Her walls and towers would be broken down. Her soil would be scraped away, and she would become like a shining bare rock. The fishermen would use this area for drying their nets. And if you look a little bit closer at chapter 26, it has a few more details that said the settlements of the countryside would be slaughtered. Now that's where we read, and her daughters in the field will be slain by the sword. That is a metaphor for satellite cities or the suburbs that were all up and down the coast of Phoenicia. And so that that's what that meant. The daughters of Tyre was actually the suburbs that went up and down the coast. And so King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon would come against Tyre, and he would lay siege and tear down Tyre's walls and houses. That's in verse 12. We'll get to it. And Tyre's stones, woodwork, and soil would be thrown into the water. We'll get to that too. So it says many nations would come against Tyre in waves. And of course, you had the first one there was Babylon, then Alexander the Great, and then Antiochus the Third, and then Rome, and then finally the Saracens. And the Crusaders, they'd go back and forth on that. So I mean, even there in modern history, there's been some battles, some bombarding of Tyre by the Israelis because Hamas was shooting stuff over into Israel. And so Israel had to go in there and take out the rocket launchers and stuff like that in Tyre. And that was back in, that was during the Lebanese Civil War. And that was about 1982, if I remember correctly. So, all right. Any comments or questions? One thing about it, each successive wave of conquerors that came through here reduced Tyre in its power, its influence, its commercial vigor was diminished each time it was conquered. And now it says that, we'll find out that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Tyre. Well, he didn't destroy the island because Nebuchadnezzar didn't have a navy, and all he had was an army. So they went through there and destroyed the mainland part of Tyre. Okay, and so let's go ahead and look at the next verses. For thus says Adonai Elohim, behold, from the north I will bring against Tyre Nebuchadnezzar, and the king of Babylon, king of kings, with horses and chariots, with horsemen and a vast army of troops. He will slaughter your daughters in the field with the sword. He will build siege works against you, cast up an assault ramp against you, and raise up shields against you. He will thrust his battering engines against your walls. He will tear down your towers with his weapons. You will be covered with dust from the multitude of his horses. At the noise of his horsemen, wheels and chariots, your walls will shake when he enters your gates as men enter a breached city. So Nebuchadnezzar's siege, at this point, Ezekiel actually names who it is that's coming in. And I think this is the first actual reference to Nebuchadnezzar, because he just says before the kings from the north, and that's where the route that Nebuchadnezzar used. He went up along the Euphrates until he got over to the coastal plain, and then came down south rather than going through the Jordanian desert to attack Tyre. So this is the first time that he actually identifies by name Nebuchadnezzar. And so they're pretty much restricted. Babylon was pretty much restricted to just what they could do in a land campaign against Tyre, as opposed to a naval naval campaign that we'll see later on. It began not long after Ezekiel's words against the city. According to the first century Jewish historian Josephus, Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Tyre for an incredible 13 years. Can you imagine a siege lasting 13 years? And so he wrote that, this is what Josephus wrote. He says, I will now add the records of the Phoenicians, for it will not be superfluous to give the reader demonstrations more than enough on this occasion. In them we have this enumeration of the times of their several kings. Nebuchadnezzar besieged Tyre for 13 years in the days of Ithobaal, their king. After him reigned Baal 10 years. And that's in Josephus' writing against Apion. It's chapter 1, verse 21, in case you're, inquiring minds want to know. So Josephus also quoted an account that unfortunately hasn't survived till our day by a historian named Philostratus, and he lived from somewhere around 170 to 250 BCE, and he also wrote down some things quoted by Josephus. Said this king, he's talking about Nebuchadnezzar, besieged Tyre 13 years, while at the same time Ethbaal reigned in Tyre. All right, so we don't really have a whole lot of information on that. There's really not a lot of archaeological evidence of all of this, but we know there's a couple of things. We know that it was going to be long. Ezekiel added, we'll get to it in a few more weeks, chapter 29, he says, Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made his army labor hard against Tyre. Every head became bald and every shoulder chafed, but he and his army had no profit from Tyre for the labor that he had expended against it. Therefore, thus says Adonai Elohim, behold, I will give the land of Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He will carry off her abundance, take her spoil, and make her prey. It will be the wages for his army. I have given him the land of Egypt as his wages for which he served, because they worked for me. It is a declaration of Adonai. Now that we'll see again in Ezekiel 20, chapter 29 and 18 to 20. So so here, he's actually saying that Nebuchadnezzar, he expended so much energy and so much treasure against Tyre. It kind of became just an ego thing with him, because it certainly was not profitable to him. So going ahead, so with the hooves of the horses, he will trample all your streets. He will kill your people with the sword. The pillars of your strength will come down to the ground. They will rob your riches and plunder your merchandise. They will tear down your walls and destroy your fine houses. They will cast your stones and your lumber and your dust into the midst of the sea. And I will put an end to the sound of your songs. The sound of your lyres will no longer be heard. I will make you as a bare rock. You will be a place for spreading in nets. You will be built no more, for I, Adonai, have spoken. It is a declaration of Adonai. All right. So in this few verses here, we see that it talks about the slaughter of their daughters of the people, and the pillars of your strength will come down. Now this may possibly, not real clear, but may possibly mean that the most important citizens of Tyre would be cut down and destroyed. And so therefore, when you cut the leadership off from a people, that many times then that they are subjugated because other people can't rise to the occasion. Just again, depending on the culture of the people and so forth. As an example, the Russians were always, that was one of the things that they just had a real problem with in dealing with American strategy and so forth. Because in Russia, if you take out the colonel, the general, or whatever, they don't really have they don't have a chain of command that would allow the majors or the captains or the lieutenants to come and jump into the place and lead the troops. And so, the Russians in some of their manuals talked about how the Americans are so structured that that even if a general or their colonels or whatever were killed off, the sergeants can come in and take command of the troops and continue on with the battle, just unfazed because of the training and so forth that the Americans had. And so there again, this is something that the Bible talks about, that they cut off those pillars of strength, their officers, their leaders, their politicians, and at that point, they were lost. So they of course plundered all of mainland Tyre, everything that they had not, Tyre had not moved over onto the island, everything that was left on the mainland. And they didn't figure that they could be beat because they had, big, fine walls and so forth. But they were. I mean, it was totally plundered, totally destroyed. And then they talk about the walls and the stones being thrown into the sea. Again, we'll get to that. And the prophecy of the net drying is still there. Okay. Comments or questions? Okay, thus says Adonai, Elohim to Tyre, will the coastlands not shake at the sound of your downfall? When the wounded groan, when the slaughter is made in your midst, then all the princes of the sea will come down from their thrones. They will cast aside their robes. They will take off their richly woven garments. They will clothe themselves with trembling. They will sit on the ground. They will tremble every moment and be appalled at you. All right, so what does that mean? The fall of Tyre was had a tremendous effect on the maritime world of that day. A lot of these cities up and down the coast were allied to Tyre, or they were even, in some cases, they were even colonies of Tyre. They actually belonged to, people had gone in there and set up cities or whatever that were loyal to Tyre because they were Tyrians. They were people from Tyre. And so that's what they're talking. The princes of the sea, they'll come down to the thrones. This would be so bad that a lot of these guys are going to just abdicate their throne. Says, no, I'd rather live as a nobody than to die as a somebody. And because I knew that if they were a somebody, the Babylonians were going to come in and make them, instead of a live nobody, they were going to make them a dead somebody. And so they decided, well, I can give up this all of this goody stuff as long as I'm able to live. And so they did. And they just turned over their city or whatever to the conquerors, the Babylonians. And that way they avoided the fate that befell Tyre, as we'll see in a little bit. But it just destroyed made everybody really, really scared. So they will lift up a lament and say to you, how you have perished, you who were inhabited from the seas, the renowned city, strong in the sea, you and your inhabitants, who spread their terror for all your inhabitants. Now the coastlines will tremble in the day of your downfall. The islands of the sea will be terrified at your demise. Now, there again, this is it's written as a funeral dirge. And if you were doing the Hebrew here, it would shift from, we would say it shift from prose to poetry, but the poetry is a sad da 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 da. It's like the old a funeral dirge is so slow and sad and mournful, and so we don't get it. We don't pick it up in the English translations, but those two verses were a form of a funeral dirge that would be recognized in the ancient world by that's what that was. And so these leaders that had cast off their robes to step down, they recognized that this judgment was going to catch up to them too, that they were not immune from the judgment of Tyre that was coming. And so that's another reason why they decided, well, if I give up everything and become a common person again, maybe I can escape the fate of these guys in Tyre. And so they were very right in their assessment to be they should have been afraid for their own lives. That's for sure. All right. So going ahead, that for thus says Adonai Elohim, when I make you a desolate city like the cities that are uninhabited, when I bring the flood upon you and the great waters cover you, then I will bring you down with them who descend into the pit. To the people of long ago, I will make you dwell in the lowest parts of the earth, like the waste places of old, with those who go down to the pit, so you will not be inhabited or radiate splendor in the land of the living. So basically what they're saying here, one of the greatest fears that sailors have is being lost at sea, getting into a situation where your boat is overwhelmed in a storm, and you're going to drown. You're going to die out there at sea. And that's, especially back in those days where the boats were, they had boats and ships and so forth, but they still were not like what we have today, which, of course, that was the best technology that they had back in those days, the wooden boats. But still in all, it was a dangerous trade to go to sea. And they would have been very afraid of dying at sea. And at the same time, the Bible is saying here, now what we're going to do to you is the waves are going to crash over you. Again, a metaphor for these conquering armies that are coming in. And they're going to just send you down to into the pit. Basically, he's saying here, these armies are going to come in there and just send you to hell. That's exactly what they're saying. Down to Sheol, a place of the dead, and so it's not in the place of the living. And so when he did say that. So you will not be inhabited or radiate splendor in the land of the living. So does that mean that Tyre was not going to rebuild? Well, we know it has in some manner rebuilt, but it's still not that big a deal anymore. There's a city there now, but it wasn't rebuilt like cities would have been back in those days, where, within just a few years, well, here they come and they rebuild everything and pile on, the rocks. And like you go to some of these other cities like, Hatzor and Beth Shemesh, just any one of these archaeological digs where they go through the layers. Well, a city would be conquered, and so somebody come back in, pick up the walls, redo the walls, and then they would start building up again. And that didn't happen with Tyre. It just nothing happened with them, and so they were a place to dry their nets. I found a a picture that was used, those old little deals where you look into, and it had the circle in it, and you could look at it. What it was is two pictures. And so, and I can't remember the name of what you call those little things, but you'd look at them and then you'd click it. But it was a ViewMaster. That's there you go. But it was kind of what it gave you was a little bit of a 3D picture, the way it was, because they were just the way the angles of it were and so forth. Well, I found one of those things of somebody back in the 1800s with nets, and they were drying the nets out there on the just flat surfaces of Tyre. And so it was an actual photograph from the 1800s. And I thought that was pretty interesting. But the idea that they would not be rebuilt or radiate splendor in the land of the living, Tyre never again, after all of these waves of things, never again regained the world prominence that they had in the maritime field. The last verse, and this is not the end of the class because I got a whole lot more to say. The last verse is, I will make you a horror, and you will no longer exist. Though you are sought for, you will never be found again. It is a declaration of Adonai Elohim. All right. And so this, again, is a metaphorical saying, because Tyre still exists today, but it's just basically nothing compared to what it was back 3,500 years ago or 2,500 years ago. Well, that would have been 2,500 years ago. It was a world dominant city. Now it's nothing. And they're struggling to just maybe get some tourists come in or something like that. And, so it is definitely not a rich city any longer. Now, I wanted to talk about, what about, that's the end of our scriptures, but I wanted to go back in a little bit more on the history and do a history lesson that, we talked about Babylonian soldiers coming in and having this 13-year siege against Tyre, and said that, you remember the part where everyone would be bald-headed, and their shoulders would be rubbed raw. Well, what that's a reference to is that wearing those helmets all the time and their armor, it just basically rubbed their hair off their head, and their shoulders rubbed raw. That's that armor that they would that they had to wear. That, I'm sure that was very heavy stuff, and it would eventually, wear their clothes and so forth. So it would be very, very uncomfortable for them. So they were able to take the mainland city, but they never were able to really take over the island part of the city, even though they came through and they just destroyed lots of people on the mainland. They could not do anything about the city itself, the island itself, and they had no navy. And so Tyre still had their ships that could come in and go out just pretty much with impunity. And so they were able to survive quite a long time. And so this is, then Ezekiel, the Lord told Ezekiel that because this is going to be so expensive for Nebuchadnezzar, and he's doing what I told him to do, I'm going to go ahead and let him have Egypt just for payment, and so that he'll have something to resupply his coffers. He'll go and take money and take treasure from Egypt. So now there's not a whole lot of archaeological or historical record for, the Babylonian siege of Tyre and the invasion of Egypt is very limited. But they did find in 1926, they found this German archaeologist, Eckhard Unger. He found a clay tablet, and it talked about the food and the provisions for food for the king and his soldiers for their march against Tyre. And so there were other cuneiform tablets that they found that talked about this same incident, so of the siege. So then there is also a cuneiform tablet that they found, and it's at the British Museum now. It shows that Nebuchadnezzar did, in fact, successfully invade Egypt and carried off a lot of treasure. And he did not take the island city by force. It seemed like that finally, they negotiated a surrender after 13 years. And so either King Ethelbald of Tyre died during the siege, or he surrendered to the Babylonians to be replaced by his son Baal, who then became a Babylonian puppet ruler. This is probably what happened, and it's supported by ancient lists of foreign kings that resided in Babylon, who, like the the Judean king Jehoiakim, they were prisoners dependent on the Babylonian monarch for their lives. So there was at the top of this list an unnamed king of Tyre. So we know that Tyre did eventually the island part of it did eventually fold. So even if you look at that, that's only kind of partially fulfilled, because the city on the island still stood and basically unharmed. It's just that somehow maybe they ran out of food or something, or I don't know. We don't have a whole lot of record over that, but the city still stood, and it's not a place for drying nets. And so what we'll have to go forward then to Alexander the Great. Now, remember what we said. Alexander the Great wanted to go and offer a sacrifice in the temple of Heracles, which is that's the Greek word. The Roman word was Hercules, and the southern part of the island city of Tyre was basically dedicated to Hercules or Heracles, and they had a temple there. And so he wanted to go there and offer a sacrifice. And so the Tyrians decided, nah, we don't think that we wanted you to, we'd like for you to go there. And so they didn't allow Alexander the Great to come through there, because probably rightfully so. They figured that if we open the gates and let this guy come in, then, before we know it, he's got to have that's just going to be an opportunity for his army to come in there and take over. And they probably were right in that regard. So Alexander then, he got kind of angry with them. And so he told them that he was going to come back in and make their island part of the mainland. That they would no longer be an island. And so they still refused him, and then the fight was on. So Alexander wanted to take Tyre, because that's just was in the way of his plans to conquer the world. So what happened then was he started taking, he knew that it would be difficult to try to do it from a sea assault, just a purely assault by the sea. So he started taking the ruins that had been knocked down from, the mainland city of Tyre, They started taking those blocks and then throwing them into the sea, making a causeway, or other terms called a mole. And so this happened in 332 BC. Now you remember, I believe that Alexander the Great died then in 333 BC. But at this point, he had his men start putting this mole, they call it, or a causeway out to the city of Tyre. And it was about 50 to 60 meters wide. I think what's the width of a football field? 50 yards. So roughly the width of a football field, and the length, it was about 800 meters. So half a mile out there, something like that. Along that, so they built this causeway. Well, once they got up close to the city of Tyre, well, then the army from Tyre, they were behind these very, very tall walls. Well, they were able to just rain down arrows on top of the Greek soldiers, and so they built these two siege towers and put them out there on the end of the causeway, and they covered the front part of it with rawhide so that it could resist the fiery arrows that would be sent their direction. So the Tyrians, then people from Tyre, they devised a plan that they took an old ship that wasn't all that great, and tied buckets of a flammable, some kind of I don't know, whale oil. Well, probably not whale oil. Probably a pitch or a tar or something like that. That occurred naturally, that they used for oil. It could have been maybe even olive oil, but anyway, they tied them to the mast of the ship, and then had another two ships tow it out there right up against that jetty, and then they let it on fire, and it caught the siege engines on fire, and that stopped the Alexander the Great's siege against Tyre for about 5 minutes. And so he went immediately back and said, okay, this is not going to happen to us again. And so he chartered about 230, I don't know if it's got on here, but he chartered about 230 vessels from Cyprus, and then all the other cities up and down the coast there, that he had already conquered them, so he could commandeer their ships. Well, he had about 230 ships, and effectively bottled up the Tyrian navy in those two harbors, and they couldn't get out, couldn't do anything. And so in effect, that's how he was able to then protect himself. Then even though they could still shoot arrows down onto the causeway, his siege engines were so tall then that they were taller than the walls of Tyre, and his archers could then shoot into the city itself. And eventually it had its effect. The navy that Alexander had put together, they had some battering rams on these galleys, where stroke, and they were able to break through into the harbor of Tyre, destroy the ships, and then they would, around the city, they would try to find places where they could get up close enough that they could ram the walls Eventually, they were able to ram the wall and get a small breach in there. Once they had a breach going and could maybe make some progress in going through the walls, Alexander the Great himself led the charge into Tyre. And so that's how Tyre actually fell. And so at this point, he'd gone in there and conquered them rather than trying to just starve them out, and built this causeway. Well, what that did was it all altered the coastline, because you got this causeway of stone and stuff out there. Well, as the ocean currents there in the Mediterranean kept sweeping down back and forth, it filled in with the sand, and so that's why these pictures that we've shown here of Tyre. Let's see, a couple more. Here's right there. All right, so this line right here might have been, the coastline was probably like this. Well, this line here was probably the line that went out to the island, and so then he also built a secondary mole there, a causeway. But the sea started depositing sand along this, and it grew then until it was basically a peninsula out there rather than just an island. And so he took the people, and it was not pretty. I mean, he slaughtered, let me see if I can get, I said that 6,000 of the Tyrians, the defenders, died in a battle with, where here comes Alexander the Great leading the charge, and only 400 of Alexander's men died. Now, we don't know if those figures are exaggerated, if they're correct or anything, but if the ratio was correct, then or roughly connect, then it was not even close. That the Tyrians lost a lot more men, and so they said that 30,000 of the citizens of Tyre were subsequently sold into slavery, while 2,000 soldiers that had survived the invasion, they were taken out to the beach area and had their hands nailed up to the trees and posts, and until they were dead, because they couldn't pull their hands out of the with the nails. So they just hung them up there attached to these trees or whatever until they died. Well, the Roman Empire looked at that and says, "Oh boy, we can do better than that." And so then they eventually developed what we now call this public execution of the crucifixion. Putting people up on a cross, and there were many variations of it, whether it was a cross like an X or a cross like a T, or if it was just one pole sticking up, and they just put your hands up there and nail you to it. And so they also said that somehow 15,000 Tyrians were secretly saved from Alexander, because remember, he chartered vessels from all up and down the coast. Well, these would have been they were related by either blood or culture or whatever, and so they said that they quietly got about 15,000 of them out. And so then that was basically that was the end of Tyre as any kind of any commercial venture at all, and it never did rebuild that prominence that it had before. And but an interesting thing is that during the time of Yeshua in Jerusalem, they used the Tyrian shekel. It's called a tetradrachma, tetradrachma, They used that that was the only acceptable coin that they could use to pay the temple tax in Jerusalem. Because why? Because it was pure silver. And even though if they use these, if that was the case, it would have had the image of Baal of Tyre on it, or Tyre on it. It's just kind of an interesting aside that they use the Tyrian money, the shekel from Tyre, to pay the temple taxes. And so the people from some of the people from Phoenicia, they escaped all of that, and then they went to Carthage in North Africa, and Carthage became a very important trading city, and actually rivaled Rome for a while. And you've heard of the famous general Hannibal, and how he had crossed the Alps with elephants and so forth. So Yeshua himself visited Tyre, and he cured a demon-possessed child of a Phoenician woman there. And these people would also walk over and into the northern Galilee area and listen to Yeshua teach. And so a lot of them must have taken hold of that, because then some 20 years after Yeshua was there, Paul went through there and stayed with a bunch of believers in Yeshua. So they had established a messianic community in that area, in Tyre. And so anyway, that pretty much concludes it for tonight.